Hello and welcome to episode 306 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm good, Andy. We've had some great reviews, which is always a way to brighten my week, which you're going to read two of them out, aren't you, this week? It's been fantastic, and we're in that Q1, that first quarter of the year, which is a incredibly busy time for us. But also, it's interesting to see we're in a slightly privileged position. We obviously have the Money to Masses website, and seeing what people are reading about and what they're interested in relation to the real world and the behaviours is fascinating. And I'm actually referring to GameStop, which is a story that I talked about on this week's Midweek Markets podcast, where it seems to be David versus Goliath, where the armchair investors are basically trying to bankrupt hedge funds. It's fascinating to watch. I'm not sure in the long run it's necessarily a positive thing, obviously, because if you listen to Midweek Markets, I talk about what the whole situation is. But the reason it might not be great for markets is because obviously people might have to start liquidating positions in terms of hedge funds, which won't be good for them through the wider market. But it's a fascinating story, and if nothing else, it engages people with money. And we can see from our side, there seems to be people getting very intrigued, which I'm slightly worried about, in going and buying shares, I think, on the back of what's going on over in the US. So slightly concerned about that trend, but hopefully things will moderate, I think, over time. But it just shows you money impacts us all, and it's a fascinating time.
I bet if barbershops were open and taxi drivers were busy, it's the one thing they'd all be talking about. And you've always said, isn't it, that's the measure of when it's hitting the mainstream. If your taxi driver or barber is talking about it, then it's possibly too late already. Is it something like that?
That's what I always said. That was the taxi driver or barber indicator. If they're talking about when we had the Bitcoin bubble many years ago, that was an indicator as to that we were in a bubble. Funnily enough, the one I mentioned before, I digress, because the person who asked me about Bitcoin was the most unlikely person I ever thought at the time, was Lauren's other half. And he asked me, and saying his football teammates were getting into Bitcoin. That was, to me, the indicator this was going to blow and pop. And it popped the next day, which was fascinating. I obviously told him to steer clear at that point. But why that is quite a nice circular reference, because Lauren is on the podcast this week. So I'm going to throw that out there. Before we get into what we're talking about, Lauren is on the podcast by popular demand. Those of you out there wanted her to come on and do a particular topic, which I'll tell you about. But Andy, do you want to quickly read out two reviews that we had this week, which we are very grateful for?
Yeah, absolutely. The first one was titled Excellent, and it's from Old MJ1. I love listening to this podcast on my weekly drive to and from work in deepest, darkest Cornwall. The articles are interesting and intelligently put together, and unlike other podcasts, the sound is just right to drown out the winter rain. Keep up the good work, lads. I always like to hear comments about sound because it is my baby. The next one is about our Black Book episode, and Chloe1909 got in touch to say, guys, what a superb idea, quite poignant in these uncharted times. Hopefully this will help the loved ones left behind, especially when there is a tendency of one individual overseeing all of the home finances, which more often than not tends to be the husband. Keep up the good work. So two fantastic reviews. We always say it. We always leave it too late, actually, to the end of the podcast. I'm going to say it now once again. We love getting your feedback, not just because it's great for us to motivate us, to push us forward. It really helps the podcast itself grow and reach other people. So if you can, pop onto iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts and pop a 5-star review on there with a few words. It'll be really good.
And it's also interesting because sometimes people come back with their own thoughts on topics we do. So I just want to mention, I think you pronounce it Sagar, who wrote in and gave some wonderful feedback on it was a Black Book episode of the podcast, and they mentioned that they loved the idea of the Black Book, but they took it one step further to suggest that you do a dry run through with your family, so almost a slightly morbid pretend you're dead scenario, so they can understand how it works, things to ask and look for with using that information. So it actually takes it one step further to actually say, well, I produced this, now you give a trial run if you can find out the information in terms of how to use it.
I like that.
A bit like planning your escape route for the fire alarm. You're not actually doing anything, you're just sort of theoretically thinking, is this going to be enough for that person to be able to do the task that we were talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting that gives you a chance just to iron out the creases and ask just a couple of questions that, this is all here and it kind of makes sense, but what's this bit here? Where does that fit in? Like you say, on a fire drill, you can check whether Simon's actually in the toilet or whether he's gone out for a fag, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, good stuff. So you mentioned earlier, you've already sort of let the cat out of the bag. We have got Lauren coming up on the podcast in just a second. What else have we got on the podcast?
I'll start with Lauren just because people are wondering what the piece is going to do. But recently when we did our team takeover, it was mentioned on there by Lauren about paying off debt and how she'd cleared a whole load of debt in the last year. And it's a very popular topic. Now, obviously for some people, they might not have debt, but for a lot of people they do, and they're trying to clear debt, particularly at the start of a new year. And so people were asking, could Lauren come on and explain how she did it? Any tips in terms of clearing her debt and how she did it so quickly? So let's get it straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. And Lauren's coming on to tell us that and explain what she did. I'm going to do an investing piece on how you can beat any benchmark you choose over the long term. And the final thing is the one task that everybody should do as soon as they wake up each day to ensure that they will be better at their finances, to ensure success. It's the one thing I do every day.
Okay, so we'll start with the investing piece as we normally do, and it's about beating benchmarks, how you can guarantee to beat any benchmark.
Yeah, so this was inspired by a piece of 80/20 investor research that I carried out this week. And it was based around the sort of tenure of the longest serving fund managers out there. What happened? Interactive Investor sent out a piece of research. It was a table really that was linked to Joe Biden's inauguration. So he is the oldest US president, and what often happens is that PR companies or people who want to appear in the news, in this case an investment platform, will take a sort of tenuous link between a current event and something they want to talk about, something that they do. So in this case it was the fact that Joe Biden is the oldest US president in history, and they linked it to fund managers who have been successful and have had the longest tenure. So they've been fund managers for a long period of time. And if you look at the table they produced, there were 10 managers on a list that run unit trusts that have typically been fund managers from sort of 25 to 33 years. So a hell of a long time. And the implication is that these managers have outperformed their benchmarks over a long period of time because they are successful managers and they've enjoyed these long track records and this long tenures at their funds. If you think about it, fund management has some parallels to football management. They are assessed on results. They have to deliver compared to what's expected of them. And they tend to not move around all that much. So if you have a very successful manager, they will probably stay at a fund house for a long period of time, a bit like a football manager, because they'll be well looked after and they will be incentivized. Whereas obviously if they don't deliver, they get fired and get replaced. So there's kind of parallels here. So the idea being that this table was showing those managers who've been their longest in their positions at fund managers and how much they'd beaten their benchmarks over that time. So you looked at it and there were some incredible numbers on there. You sit there and think these men and women have absolutely smashed it. And so the idea being that you would perhaps pick these people as they are proven fund managers over the long term, because as we know, and we've covered on the podcast before, fund managers don't tend to outperform their benchmarks or the market over the long term. And a large part of that is because of compounding of charges. So for 80/20 investor members, I actually started to drill down into what actually went on in these managers' careers and whether this idea that because somebody's had a very successful long-term track record of beating their benchmark, whether that means that you should invest in them. And there are some really interesting insights in there. And some of that is also draws upon my own experience when I worked in the city, some of the things that I knew that went on in the background of fund houses and fund managers and what went on. So if you want to get the insights from that piece, then feel free to take out an 80/20 investment trial. Needless to say, the conclusions of Interactive Investor are not held by me after doing the research. But what it also gave birth to is an interesting concept and something that I want to teach podcast listeners, that it is possible to beat any benchmark that you wish, which sounds quite an incredible statement. But what it is using the power of mathematics to be able to beat any benchmark. Now, imagine that you've decided that you want to beat a particular benchmark that you may be investing in. Maybe it's got a 60-40 split, 60% equities, 40% bond. Now, you want to beat that over the long term. if you want to do it, the secret is to start investing. Of course, you're going to be mindful of your benchmark. But if you invest aggressively and at a point where you inevitably, if you invest aggressive enough, the markets will eventually fall in your favor. It's more likely than not because markets over time tend to go up. And if you recall in past podcasts, I've talked about the longer the time frame, the more likely you are going to make money in a market because it goes up. Over 20 years, it's almost 100% certainty you'll make more money or have more money than you started with. So there will likely come a point, if you are aggressive, that you will start to beat your benchmark. Then at that point, if you then decided, even if that happened after 6 months, or it happened after a year or 3 years, you then went and mirrored your benchmark like for the rest of eternity. For the next 30 years, you will outperform your benchmark over the long term. And what is interesting about this is that it's the impact of compounding that you are taking advantage of. Because what happens, if you imagine, compounding is that snowballing effect. If you have a small win, so you've beaten your benchmark by a relatively small amount, over time, even if you get the same annual return as your benchmark for the next 30 years, for example, that difference starts to widen, and it starts to get wider and wider because of the effects of compounding. Think of it, you having a slightly bigger snowball that you're rolling down a hill than your benchmark. By the time you get to the bottom of the hill, your snowball is going to be even bigger in comparison relatively to the snowball next to you that was the benchmark. And to illustrate that point, this isn't just me making this up, to illustrate this point, if you imagine you had £100,000 and you invested it and you had a benchmark that you were being conscious of, that you also invested £100,000. If in the first 3 years of this experiment you achieved 8% a year return, now this is just an example, I'm not saying how you would achieve that, but just say you got 8% return in that first 3 years. Now let's say your benchmark got 5% a year in those first 3 years. It's not a huge difference, it's significant enough, but it's not huge. So you've outperformed your benchmark, say, in 3 years in a row. Okay. By the end of those 3 years, if you had £100,000 invested at the start, with your benchmark, you'd have £115,762. With the fund that you're running, you would have £125,000. So that's broadly a £10,000 difference, which is pretty good. You'd be quite pleased with that. But given that you've pushed the boat and you've managed to get ahead of your benchmark, if for the next 30 years you then just mirrored the benchmark as much as you can, in fact, you could even invest in the benchmark, what would happen, assuming that, let's say, the benchmark then got 10% a year return for the next 30 years. So did you, because you were just mirroring it. By the end of the next 30-year period, so we've been investing for 33 years in total, the benchmark for the whole term, you would have £2,019,000. I'm giving you the sort of rounded numbers just for ease. But if you'd followed the process that I'd said, where you'd invested the money yourself, you'd beaten your benchmark for a short period of time, and then you'd mirrored it for the next 30 years, in fact, what you would end up having is you would have £2,198,122. If you take the difference, you would actually have a difference at the end of this total 33-year period of £178,135. It's a huge number, but actually for most of it, so for 30 years out of 33, so basically 90% of the time, you've been getting the same return. But because of the difference you had at the start, and you then compound it over time, that difference in numerical terms gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And this impact of compound is incredibly powerful. But it's also why people should be careful when they hear about managers over the long term beating their benchmark. I remember you couldn't move in the investment press and reading I'm talking about the weekend press here, so the nationals, who would sit there and talk about Neil Woodford turning £1,000 into how many tens of thousands over the length of his career, before the point when it all went horribly wrong. And that was a stat that they would come out with time and time and time again, looking at the amount of money he'd made over the long term. It tells you nothing about how good a manager is now. If I'd done the process I just described, I would sit there and say to somebody who had done just invested in the benchmark, and I'd done the process of taking risk, outperforming it in a very short period of time, and then following the benchmark, I'd be sitting there and maybe have bought another house for £178,000 or whatever I'd done. I would look like the more successful investor, the smarter person. But actually, all I've done is play the numbers, the mathematics behind it. And I've used time and compounding to my advantage. And of course, that is why when you see the long-term performance numbers of a fund manager, you should dismiss them compared to their benchmark. You want to look at the short term as well. What's happening in the current market, 1, 3, 5, 10 years. Don't just look at their career, as happens in these pieces about managers who have the longest track records end up being the best performers. There is almost, it's a kind of a cause of an effect argument here. The fact that they've been there for a long period of time is part of the reason probably why they actually are outperforming their benchmarks. It looks so impressive. Now, like I say, I analysed the performance of fund managers' careers, which is interesting in the 80/20 investor article. So go and have a look at that, because there's some nuances I explain in there that you might want to bear in mind. But this idea that I'm talking about now, to illustrate it even better, so it really hits home to people, Warren Buffett is, well, he's considered probably the most successful investor of all time. And what I want to illustrate to you is that Warren Buffett is a good investor, but he's not the best. And I saw some numbers that were crunched around Warren Buffett and his wealth when he was at age 91, so it's just a couple of years ago. And at that point, he was worth $84.6 billion. Now, of that $84.6 billion, 84.2 of it was actually accrued after his 50th birthday. And $81 billion was actually made after his mid-60s. And that might sound incredible to people, but that is the power of compounding. He'd made money over time, but when you think about a snowball that gets bigger, 10% on a bigger number is an even bigger outcome, and that compounds and snowballs, etc., etc. To illustrate the point even more is that Warren Buffett started investing when he was 10. By the time he was 30, he had about $1 million that he was using to invest, and that's worth about $9 million in today's money. If instead Warren Buffett had been a normal person who hadn't been investing since the age of 10, I mean, who does that? Ideally, people should. And this is, again, goes back to the millionaire episode that I talked about and I did, that shows the power of this compounding. If instead he'd been like most people, not done much, maybe he had $25,000 by the age of 30 rather than the $1 million, and he started to invest. If he'd had the same results, the same annual return year in, year out as he's done over his career, rather than the $84 billion that he is worth at the age of 91, it would be more in line, probably about $12 million. That is a big sum, but it's not 84 billion. And that's because of the compound effect. If you imagine he'd been like most people, maybe he started investing at 30, but he stopped investing at 60. Then by the time he got to his 90s, he would be worth that $12 million. That is a huge difference to the 84 billion that he was worth at the age of 91. So it just shows you that what made Warren Buffett successful is the fact that he's been investing for 80 years. He's got that compound effect. Yes, he is a good investor, but when you compare his returns, there are other people out there who have outperformed him. So the message here is that it's about compounding over time. That is what makes the largest sum. And so to beat any benchmark, what you really need to do is have longevity. You get ahead and you just stay the course. Because if Warren Buffett is the most successful investor in the world, and one of the key things, yes, he's good at it, is taking advantage of compounding. That is exactly what we should be doing if we want to be good investors and successful and have the most money when we get to the grand old age of 91.
Okay, so moving on, and we've got a returning guest that is Lauren on the next part of the show. Now, Lauren is our senior consumer writer at Money to the Masses. She deals with the socials, and she was also on the team podcast that we did just prior to Christmas. Now, one thing that Lauren mentioned in that podcast was that she'd saved a hell of a lot of money, and a few people got in touch to say, wow, how did she do it? So Lauren is here to explain how she did it. Lauren, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back on the podcast. So just a brief summary, just so that those who haven't heard before. When I was on the podcast recently, I was telling everyone how I like to save quite a lot of my salary. And that's because, a bit of backstory is, I'm trying to save for a house with my partner. So we're obviously trying to save as much as we can each month. But this actually came from me trying to clear off my credit card. So we both decided that before we was going to save for a house, that we wanted to clear off any credit card debt that we had, so that we could basically maximize all of our monthly payments, so that all of it could go towards saving for a house. So in December 2019, I had a bit of an epiphany, And I decided that that was it. I'm going to clear off my credit card. And the balance of my credit card was £2,337.25. And it took me 5 months to clear off the credit card. So in April 2020, I cleared off that credit card. So today I just wanted to share how I managed to clear that credit card off, and then how I managed to use those tips to now carry on saving for a house. And as a result, we've managed to save quite a large amount towards the deposit. So hopefully you would all be able to get something from what I'm going to be talking about today to take away and apply it to your own finances.
Yeah, so just to reiterate that, I know some people won't have debt and they might sit there and think this isn't relevant to me. What it is, the process that Lauren, I'm privy to what she will talk about because she has obviously spoken to me before, is exactly the same if you were trying to become financially independent or save money to invest. Like Lauren is now in the process of hopefully trying to buy a house as a result of doing this. So the debt part was the first stage, and now she's going on. So I just want to point that out to people because it's the process that is what really worked. And you've actually helped other people use it. I know you've told me in the past, friends, etc. So sorry, Lauren, you carry on.
Yeah, so to try and make it simple, I've kind of split it down into different stages. So the first stage was with the credit cards and identifying the debt. So I identified the loans, credit cards, the different types of debt and where the debt was. So I knew that I then had to prioritize the debts, the most expensive debt first. So the one with the highest interest rate. Or one of mine was coming to the end of its 0% purchase term. So once the term ended, I would then be charged interest on this debt. So that was a priority for me. So then the next step was to get a 0% balance transfer credit card to put all of the debt that was on the different cards. So I had 2 different cards and I wanted to put it in one place so that I knew I had one balance that I needed to clear. And then the final step, once this had all gone through, if you want to look into 0% balance transfer credit card, there's various tools out there that can help you to get an idea if you're going to get an accepted for a credit card before you apply. And then once you go through the process of setting up a 0% balance transfer credit card, the first thing I do is I set up regular payments by direct debit, because we always say this. Damien says it a lot: always pay more than the minimum. And he has some really handy YouTube videos over on the Money to the Masses YouTube channel where he talks about if you only pay the minimum on your debt, it can take you a lot longer. So it's really important that you set up regular payments on your credit card via direct debit. So then from here, this kind of moves on to the next phase. So now you've sorted out what's happening with your debt. This is how I then paid off the debt on the credit card when it was all in one place. So the first thing I do personally is I have more than one bank account. I actually have 3, but I use 2. So I have a Bills bank account, which is just a regular high street bank. And then I also have a Monzo bank account. And I have the app only bank purely because it allows me to separate my money into pots. Now, this is really key for what I do with trying to pay off debt and for saving, because it allows me to separate my bills. Now, I'll touch on that in a minute, because the next thing that I do is I write down all of my bills and expenses. Now, you can do this by downloading the budgeting app. Now, I've written about all of these budgeting apps. I've come on here before to talk about them. I've written an article on the Money to the Masses website, and I also wrote an article for The Guardian recently about the best budgeting apps. So make sure you go and check that out, because there's a variety of budgeting apps available and they can kind of do the hard work for you. So rather than you having to sit down and scroll through your past statements to find out what your regular payments are, the budgeting app will highlight this for you. Now then, from this, I like to make a checklist of all of the payments, and I do this in my Apple iPhone note, and I just like to tick it off once it comes out of my bank account each month. Now, you don't have to do this. You can do it either on a spreadsheet or just through your budgeting app, whatever is easiest for you. But I like to do it on my iPhone notes just because I like to know what's coming in and out of my bank account. Now, once I've written it all down, I split my payments into needs and wants. And by needs and wants, I mean the needs are the mortgage, the bills, the things that you have to pay and are really important, and you cannot afford to not have the money in your account for these payments. Now, the other ones are the wants. So these are things that you like to do. Now, it's really important with money, and I find this really important, that you don't stop yourself from doing things that you like. So, for example, I like to get my nails done, obviously pre-COVID, but I like to treat myself here and there. And then, for example, my partner, he likes to go to golf. So budget for things that you like to do. We also have a date night budget. So if we wanted to get a takeaway, we accommodate for this money in our budget. So that's your wants. But having your wants written down, you have a little bit of leeway. So if there's 1 month where you're coming up short, you know that one of your wants, you don't have to spend the money on that because it's a luxury. It's something that you don't need the money for. Now, once you've written down all of your needs and your wants and all of the payments that you want to come out of your salary each month, you need to total all of these expenses. And I call them all bills because they're all things that I want to pay for each month. And then you take this total away from your total salary amount. Then once you've done this, you should have some money left over. Now, I call this the saving money because in my total expenses, I also include what I want to spend each month. So I have a spending amount as my bill. So I have a small amount because you've already accounted for things that you want to do. So the amount that you have left over that you want to spend should be fairly minimal.
So that's like a discretionary spend. So the other bit, is that what you're saying? So you've basically got your budget tightly honed to everything from date night to nows to everything you're going down. It's all planned and accounted for, but you've got like this other one that is just for something a little bit, if there's other things that you might want to spend, a small discretionary one. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's for all those types of payments. And also there's a little buffer. If you're going to work and you want to buy a coffee, you don't have to budget for how many coffees you're going to have in a month, but you know that you have that little amount of money, that discretionary amount that you can spend on that, and you know exactly how much of that you've got. And it doesn't then eat into any of your other money, so your savings. And why that's important is because the money I have left over, I would then use that, pay yourself first, and move it straight into my savings or straight to pay my credit card off. So that money was gone. It was not there anymore because I'd accounted for everything else that I wanted to do in the rest of the month. And it's also really important that when you write down your expenses, if one of your bills comes to a certain amount, say it came to £13, sometimes I would round it up, maybe round it up to £15, just because if you did this for each bill, then you would have a slight buffer that if one of your bills went over, for example, your phone bill, you've got a slight buffer there in your bills account. Should you go over, the money is accounted for so you don't end up going into your overdraft. So that is the second phase. And then I just wanted to touch on how I actually managed to do that. So how I managed to cut my expenses down to be able to list it into my needs and wants, because to be able to save as much as I have, I really looked at my spending and analysed my spending. So for example, one of the biggest things that I did is I actually sold my car that I had on finance. I got the value of the car back. I just sold it with We Buy Any Car. I wasn't interested in making money on it. I literally just got the value for the car. And then I decided I was going to buy an older car. So at the time, I did actually get a loan, but that was still cheaper than having my car on finance. And by doing so, it reduced my car finance payments by about £100. In the end, that didn't quite work out, and I ended up selling that car. And now I share a car with my partner. Now, obviously, not everyone can do this, but actually, we don't need it.
Sorry, Lauren, I'm just going to jump in there. When Lauren said it didn't work out, what she means is the car just basically ground to a halt, didn't it, Lauren? It wasn't the financial aspect. You're talking about the car itself. It didn't work.
Yeah.
It was a car that ended up. You called it a quit on the car itself, not the principle of what you were doing. And then you've gone on and now you're sharing a car. You've basically worked out that saving on a car, you were going to share a car. How much did you save by doing that? So now you're sharing a car. How much better off are you a month?
I'm almost £400 better off a month if you total up the finance payments, the insurance, and the tax on the car. I still budget now every month for petrol. That's our deal. I pay for the petrol, and then my partner pays for the insurance and the tax. But yeah, I say I'm almost £400 better off a month because I don't have to pay for the finance of the car.
So, because one of the things that's important that people to listen to, or what you've just said, is that there's an amazing parallel with what you're saying. I wish I was as smart as you are, Lauren, when I was your age. And obviously Lauren's in her mid-20s. And I really wasn't. Because some of the principles that you're talking about are the core of what is known as the sort of financial independence, retire early movement. And one of the biggest wins that anybody ever has, when I've read a lot about it, particularly recently, just because it's quite interesting, some of the takeaways you get from that world. It's a bit extreme, but one of the biggest things that people wins in terms of them becoming financially independent was getting rid of cars. Almost unanimously, when I've looked at lots of people who've case studies and bits and pieces, and there's numbers I've seen crunched that if you can get rid of, like Lauren has, £400 a month, and you start compounding that over, let's say, a decade, the amount of money extra in terms of wealth, there are people who've started racking up an extra £100,000 in investments because they've not had a car for an extended period of time. So a car thing is a massive one on the financial independence movement, where people start looking at value. The other thing is, Lauren, what you're describing is a concept called valuists. So just for people who want to go and Google some of this stuff, to be a valuist is a concept where people go and look at value rather than cost. So they will look at the value a car brings. If you only care about going from A to B, which is exactly what you've done, and you've deemed that it doesn't provide value to you, or things that you actually care about in life, which might be certain things rather than to cut back on. So you might deem that certain, like date night and that, are important, but other things aren't. That's another concept that is central to people who do the FIRE movement, the Financial Independence Retire Early movement. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about that, because what you've actually done is you've done this in your own way, and you've created basically a process, and it can help others follow your lead. And sorry, Lauren, carry on.
Yeah, so I also, as well, I actually cut back on some of my bills and expenses. So as I mentioned earlier, when you look at a budgeting app spreadsheet or a checklist and you break down what you actually spend your money on each month, I would cut back on a few things. So for an example, I was paying for a Now TV subscription that I didn't want. If you don't actually want to cancel your Now TV subscription, there's a little tip that I did a few times. If you go in to cancel it, it actually gives you a better deal to try and convince you to stay. Now, obviously, it's one of those things that if you don't want to pay for it, just carry on and cancel it. But I had up to 50% off on one of them, and I ended up paying £3 a month for 6 months or something. So just bear that in mind. But I didn't want it, and I wanted to completely get rid of that expense. So I cancelled subscriptions and things that I didn't really need anymore and I didn't really use. So just before I summarise, I'll just quickly run through how I cleared the credit card off. And actually, I managed to clear it in just 5 months. So as I said at the beginning, in December 2019, I had £2,337.25 on my credit card, and I was like, enough is enough, I'm going to clear this off. So that month was the first month I decided to clear the credit card, and I made my first payment of £500, which included my £100 direct debit, which was what my fixed monthly payment was. And then that was it. Then I continued to implement all of these tips that I've shared with you today. And in January, I made another payment of £500. Now, February and March, I can't remember what I was doing in February and March in 2020, but I couldn't, for whatever reason, pay as much off on my credit card for those 2 months. But it didn't matter, because I still paid my minimum payment of £100. So February and March was my £100 payments. So it doesn't matter if you come across your journey and you're saving or you're trying to pay off debt, if you cannot do it every month. As long as you stick by what you're doing and you don't give up, you will be able to achieve what you want to achieve just by making these small lifestyle changes. So then back again in April, I was back to making another large lump sum payment. So that was £520. And then finally in May, I made a payment of £617.25. And that was the complete credit card paid off, and it had a zero balance. And I haven't touched it since, but I do keep it there for emergencies only, such as if my car broke down or anything like that and it needed a new tyre. I have it there for emergency spending, but I make sure that I will pay it off in full each month. And I've purposely not gone out and got another 0% purchase credit card, because I don't want to get myself in the same situation again. But hopefully, if you can implement some of those things that I've shared with you today, you will be able to do the same things. So I just wanted to quickly summarize the takeaways from what I've gone over today. So they are: prioritize your debt, open a 0% balance transfer credit card, have more than one bank account, always pay more than the minimum, include things you like in your budget, plan ahead, work out the money leaks in your bills, and pay any bills like your car insurance annually to try and save money.
And so that, like you said, the money leaks is great, Lauren. You saying about the things that people have different money leaks. Some people it's online shopping, other people it might be spending too much money on, I don't know, clothes or going out or whatever. Not that you can go out in lockdown. So that's key. And obviously one of the things is that you did stop using your credit card while you're doing all this as well, which is one of the big things to do. One thing I wanted to quickly mention before we moved on to the last piece is that the other thing that you mentioned in your plan, which I want people to take away, is the concept of a buffer. So you've come up with that, but that is again another brilliant idea, that is the buffer, that the world doesn't work like you would want it to. And if people create plans that are so tight that when something goes wrong, which it will, or things change and it breaks your plan, then it reduces the likelihood of success. And so a concept in money is this idea of building in buffers, like you say, rounding up bills and things like that, because at the end of the month, you will hopefully have stuff left over. And you were basically, alongside doing that minimum law, and as you said, you were therefore always looking for ways to pay off chunks as well during the month, weren't you? So quick chunks, which is addictive, because I know I do it with, like now you do it with your saving towards your house. I do the same thing, cut bills, don't go out, think, yeah, I can use that money, put it into my savings. So Lauren, I think that's brilliant. And the other thing to finish on is, of course, if anybody does have issues with debt, then they can, of course, go on our website and search for free debt advice. And there's a list of organisations on there which can help them for free.
Okay, so that moves us on to the final piece, and it's a short piece, this, and it's something that you wanted to share, Damien, something that you do every day. What is it?
Well, sometimes the things that have the most impact are the simplest. Like the other week when I talked about doing the direct debit review and people looking at their standing orders, and we had people who'd saved lots of money by doing it. This is a concept, the one thing everybody I think should do first thing in the morning. Some people think I'm nuts, but one of the first things I do when I wake up in the morning is pick up my phone like everybody else does. I check my bank account balance, but I one stage further than that. I actually open up the budgeting apps that I use. Now, there's a couple that I would use, but the ones that I like, I will open up and I will look at what's going on in the budgeting app. And as Lauren described, which is why it's quite relevant, is I categorize things are automatically categorized. I make sure they're categorized correctly. So there's a new day, a new bunch of things might come in. It's quite exciting categorizing these things. The accountant in me, although I've never been an accountant, but everyone's got a secret little bit they like doing when it comes to being in control of their money. I categorize things. I check my balances. By doing this one thing, it's like the idea of getting up in the morning and making your bed. If you do that one thing, it gives you a sense of achievement that you're in control. If you check your balance, bank account balance, you're not hiding from any issues. So you are facing up to the realities of the world, which is important. When you take it a step further and you're using the banking apps, like the budgeting apps, I, for example, wake up and I see what the balances are. They show you your predicted money that you'll have at the end of the month. These budgeting apps are very clever. So things like Money Dashboard and Emma, they can predict what your likely outcome at the end of the month. They will show you what your predicted direct debit's going to come out. They know, they analyze your spending. They can see. I can see if bills have come out. I can see if I've been paid. I can see if the money's gone into my savings account that I put away in that concept of paying yourself first. I can see that if the credit card balance that I want to pay off at the end of the month is less than my current account balance. I can see that no one's taken any crazy credit on my name in terms of payments, because I know what the balances roughly should be. I can look at each transaction and just see, oh, what is that? Like I say, characterize it. Because I have budgets that are in those apps, I can move things, say, oh yeah, look, do you know what? Just by looking at it, yeah, I've got another £50 a month I can spend on petrol. Or it may be I can spend on food this week. That never changes no matter how much money you have. You should be in control of it. So the one thing I want everybody to start doing, it seems extreme. You pick your phone up anyway. Let's be honest. Most people pick their phone up before they talk to their kids or their other half in the mornings. But if you do that and click it open and look at your budgeting app or look at your bank account to make sure that what's going on, but it'll be a 2-second job, but you'll be in control. And what happens, it becomes addictive. You start wanting to make sure and check one or two things, and it becomes about automating your finances. So I might do a podcast on how I automate my finances, but just checking that the machine is ticking, that everything's going along as it should be. And if you do that, you will be more likely to be better and more successful with money. So take that away. If you haven't got one of the budgeting apps downloaded, do go and have a look at one of the articles that Lauren's done. Choose the one you want. I mean, I do quite like Money Dashboard because it can be more bespoke and it's free. Find the one you want, make sure you plug in all your information, join your accounts up, your credit cards, all those things, and then you'll be in control of your finances. And make sure you create those budgets, because like Lauren, it doesn't matter if you're paying off credit or if you're trying to save for your retirement or buy a house. It's about that plan and making sure it's likely to happen, because every day you do that one thing, just check.
I think that's a great tip, Damien, and I'm glad to say it's something I do as well, probably to the detriment of family life, because I get told off for being on my phone first thing in the morning, but it's genuinely because I'm doing that. I'm just checking off, is that right? Should that be coming out? What's coming out next? We're all good, right? Let's start the day. And don't do what I did, which is what I did, I think it was yesterday morning, which was kick off about a payment that's coming out of your account. What is this £60 coming out of my account? I can't believe it. And then get yourself all stressed, and then you realise that the money isn't coming out of your account, it's actually going in. It was a refund on something that I claimed back months ago. So check whether it's a plus or a minus before you get too stressed out. Okay, so we're done this week. If you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's at moneytothemasses with a number 2. Thanks once again for Lauren being on this show. If you want to contact Lauren, of course you can do so. It's Lauren at moneytothemasses.com. And finally, our Facebook group is growing and growing and growing week on week. If you want to get involved, ask your question, maybe you want to answer other people's questions, or just get involved with a chat, it is facebook.com/groups/money-to-the-masses. So that's it, we're done for this week. Damien, it was a bit longer, but I think it was worth it.
I think it was. There's 2 shows in a row we've overrun, but I think people appreciate it. So we'll try and keep it a bit tighter next week. So until next time.
Until next time.